A 21-year-old woman goes to bed in her own home on an ordinary summer night. By morning, she's gone. No forced entry, no signs of struggle. Her car still in the driveway. Her dog still in the yard. Her purse and keys still sitting untouched inside. Just her, and her phone missing without a trace. Her fiancé calls it in the next day. Search parties comb the woods for months. And then, for almost 2 years, absolutely nothing. Until a couple walking near a creek 40 minutes away stumbles across scattered bones half buried in the mud. That discovery should have been the beginning of the end of this case. Instead, it was only the beginning of a 13-year fight for answers. One where the person investigators suspected almost from day one sat across from detectives, passed polygraph after polygraph flagged as deceptive, quietly built a whole new life. A marriage, children. While his fiancé's family waited and waited and waited for someone to finally do something about it. This is the story of Katelyn Markham, and it's a story about exactly how long it can take for the truth to catch up to a lie, if the people responsible for chasing it move slowly enough. Some crimes are solved in hours. Others remain mysteries for decades. And then there are the cases that were never what they seemed. I'm the Decoder. Welcome to True Crime Decoder, where we break down the evidence, expose the deception, and decode the stories behind the world's most fascinating crimes, scams, cyber attacks, and unsolved mysteries. If you enjoy fact-based investigations and documentary-style storytelling, consider subscribing. We uncover a new case every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, every clue matters. Every detail tells a story. Let's decode today's case. Katelyn Markham was born on August 16, 1990, to her parents Dave Markham and Charmaine Rader, and raised in Fairfield, a small suburb outside Cincinnati, Ohio. She grew up bubbly and well-loved, close with her younger sister Ollie, and even after her parents eventually separated, both continued to raise her and her sister with a lot of love and involvement. Katelyn was, by every account from the people who knew her, one of those rare people who made everyone around her feel seen. Goofy, warm, full of energy, the kind of person who lit up a crowded room without even trying. She had a genuine passion for art through her teenage years, regularly volunteering to paint murals for local events, and she carried that creative streak into her plans for the future. It was near the end of high school that she met John Carter, a local boy a couple of years older than her. The two fell into a relationship that outlasted high school entirely, growing into something serious enough that by early 2011, they were engaged, with plans to marry within a couple of years. Katelyn's family adored John. Their relationship, at least from the outside, looked stable and headed somewhere good. Katelyn had enrolled at the Art Institute of Ohio to keep building her creative career, and to help save money for both her education and their future together. She took a job at a bridal shop, the same shop where, on the morning that would change everything, she simply never showed up. That morning followed a night that started out completely unremarkable. It was August of 2011, and Fairfield, like the rest of Cincinnati, was deep in its usual summer festival season. Katelyn and John spent part of that evening enjoying it together before John left her townhouse on Dorshire Drive to head back to his mother's place for the night, which, by his own account, wasn't unusual, though not the norm either. According to John, the two continued texting for a while after he left, right up until early the next morning, when Katelyn suddenly stopped responding. Her phone, he assumed, had simply died. By the time enough hours had passed without contact, John called the Fairfield police. In that call, which would later become one of the most picked-apart pieces of audio in the entire case, he identified himself, explained that he knew he technically wasn't supposed to report someone missing before 24 hours had passed, but insisted something was deeply wrong. He described Katelyn as someone who simply wasn't the type to go silent, someone he'd been with for 6 years, someone he trusted completely. He mentioned a nearby festival, mentioned a lot of questionable people being around. He sounded, on the surface, like exactly what he claimed to be, a frightened fiancé. Because less than 24 hours had passed and Katelyn was a capable adult, police didn't treat it as urgent right away. But John wasn't willing to wait around. He went back to her townhouse himself. Her car was still in the driveway. Her dog was still in the yard, unattended. Something friends and family immediately flagged as deeply out of character. because Katelyn would never have left him like that voluntarily. Her purse, her keys, all still inside. But no sign of Katelyn herself, and no sign of her phone. As word spread through Fairfield, the response from her community was immediate and overwhelming. Friends, family, co-workers, everyone agreed this wasn't like her. When she failed to show up at the bridal shop the next day, any lingering doubt evaporated. Investigators formally opened a missing persons case, and naturally, their first 2 points of focus became her townhouse and the last person confirmed to have seen her, John Carter. Her home offered almost nothing beyond an eerie stillness. As for John, his alibi checked out cleanly. His mother confirmed he'd come home to her that night, a detail she admitted was unusual for him, but not unheard of. With no immediate leads, the case turned to the public. Search parties spread across Fairfield and into the surrounding rural areas of Butler and Hamilton counties. Parks, forests, waterways, even a mounted search unit combing the wilderness. Weeks passed, then months, then an entire year. No trace of Katelyn ever surfaced. Televised pleas from her family and from John himself aired across the state, all of it amounting to nothing. Rumors swirled through the community. Some pointed to a random stranger. Others quietly started to wonder about her own fiancé. John, for his part, dismissed any suggestion he could be involved. Why would he hurt the woman he was planning to marry? For 20 months, that question had no answer, and Katelyn had no location. Then, on April 7, 2013, a young couple exploring along Big Cedar Road in Cedar Grove, Indiana, a rural creek roughly 30 minutes from Fairfield, came across scattered bones near the water. At first, they assumed animal remains, until they found a skull, and any doubt disappeared. They called 911 immediately. It would take investigators 2 more weeks to formally confirm what almost everyone already suspected. These were Katelyn Markham's remains. For her family, it was the collapse of the one thing they'd been holding on to, the possibility that she was still alive somewhere. Now they knew she wasn't. What they still didn't know was how she died, or who was responsible, and that question would take over a decade longer to answer. The forensic reality of the case was brutal from the start. With more than a year and a half having passed since her death, only skeletal remains were left to examine. Extremely limited material for building a case. The only notable trauma on her remains was a set of 4 sharp, blunt force wounds to her left wrist bone, though investigators determined these injuries alone weren't sufficient to have caused her death. Evidence also suggested her body had likely been moved a second time after being initially disposed of elsewhere. Because of the ongoing forensic work, her remains weren't released to her family for months, delaying her funeral until August of that year, when friends, teachers, and the wider Fairfield community gathered at her old high school to finally say goodbye. With Katelyn laid to rest, the only thing left was to find her killer, and everyone close to her believed, without hesitation, that this had been no accident. In the months following her death, John Carter had gone conspicuously quiet, eventually cutting off nearly all contact with her family entirely. To people who'd once considered him practically family, that silence read as deeply suspicious. Frustrated by what they saw as painfully slow progress, Katelyn's father, Dave, pushed the Butler County Sheriff's Office to take another look at the case. Progress remained agonizingly slow. In 2016, a documentary about Katelyn's disappearance was released publicly, hoping to generate new leads. In 2017, the family hired a private investigator, who came back not with a breakthrough, but with sharp criticism of how slowly and sloppily local law enforcement had handled the case from the very beginning. In 2020, her story reached an even wider audience through a true crime documentary series. Still no arrests, still no answers. It would take 12 years after her murder for the case to finally crack open. And the crack didn't start with John Carter directly. It started with his friend and former roommate, a man named Jonathan Palmiter, who was arrested on February 17, 2023, on unrelated perjury charges. That arrest gave investigators legal grounds to search his home, the same home where John Carter had been living at the time Katelyn disappeared. Jonathan had been questioned back in 2013 and had largely faded from suspicion since. But under fresh scrutiny, cracks started forming in his story, cracks that investigators came to believe existed specifically to protect John Carter. Piece by piece, circumstantial evidence that had never individually been strong enough to justify an arrest began adding up into something far more solid. On March 22, 2023, John Carter, now 34, married, and a father, was arrested on suspicion of involvement in Katelyn's disappearance and murder. His bond was set at $1 million while prosecutors assembled their case, a case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, but evidence that painted an increasingly damning picture. During his original 2011 interview, officers had noted visible scratch marks on his neck, which he attributed to shaving at the time, a story he'd later claim he simply couldn't remember giving. Investigators also noticed something subtler and, in hindsight, chilling. Within days of Katelyn's disappearance, John had repeatedly referred to her in the past tense in interviews to media, even in private conversations. Someone still holding out hope generally doesn't accidentally start speaking about their missing loved one as though she's already gone. Then there were the polygraphs. John sat for them in 2011, 2014, and 2021. All three came back flagging deceptive responses when he was asked directly about his involvement. Digital forensics added another critical piece. Records from the night Katelyn disappeared showed John's phone completely inactive for a 15-hour stretch, from early morning into the mid-afternoon. Investigators believe this window lines up almost exactly with when Katelyn was killed and her body concealed. John maintained the two of them had been texting through the night, but there was no digital evidence to support that claim. He said he'd simply deleted the messages, a convenient gap in an otherwise carefully maintained story. A neighbor also came forward, recalling muffled, confrontational voices from Katelyn's home that night, and the word, "no," repeated more than once. None of it, individually, was enough. Together, it was more than enough to make John Carter the clear focus of the investigation. And once Jonathan Palmiter was behind bars and cooperating, the holes in John's version of events widened even further. While all of this unfolded, investigators searched John Carter's home, and what they found there was, frankly, almost too incriminating to believe. Crude drawings, poetry, journal entries, all seemingly referencing the murder of his own fiancée. One passage described an angel in the woods. Another read, "I slit your wrists with the key to your heart," a line disturbingly consistent with the only visible trauma found on Katelyn's remains. A recovered poem read like a mind arguing with itself. "Deep down I love her, you want to kill her but I love her. She must die, I can't kill her. Yes you can, no yes." It's the kind of evidence that sounds almost too on the nose to be real, and yet there it was, written down, kept, and eventually found. For a case that had spent over a decade stuck on circumstantial evidence, John Carter had apparently spent that same decade keeping a written record of his own guilt sitting in his house. John posted his $1 million bond and awaited trial under GPS monitoring, with proceedings scheduled for June 2023. Prosecutors initially hoped to pursue additional charges, including abuse of a corpse, but Ohio's statute of limitations blocked that path, since her remains hadn't been discovered until nearly 2 years after her death. After consulting with his legal team, John abandoned his claims of innocence and pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter, a move that spared him a murder trial entirely. According to the case prosecutors ultimately built, combined with the neighbor's account of a confrontational argument that night, John and Katelyn had fought. Despite their engagement, friends later testified that Katelyn had privately confided feeling increasingly trapped in the relationship in the months before her death. John admitted to disposing of her body at Cedar Creek, an area he knew well through property his family had once owned there, and claimed he panicked after accidentally killing her. On July 18, 2023, John Carter was sentenced to 3 years in prison, the maximum allowed under Ohio law for involuntary manslaughter. He showed no visible emotion during sentencing. No remorse, no reaction, nothing. For Katelyn's family, the sentence landed like a second injustice stacked directly on top of the first. 13 years of searching, waiting, and fighting for basic answers, only to watch the man responsible walk away with 3 years. A fraction of the decade plus he'd already spent free, married, raising children, occasionally crossing paths in public with the very family whose daughter he'd killed and hidden. Katelyn's sister has described passing him in public more than once, watching him carry on as though nothing had happened. In the years since, Katelyn's father has continued to push for change, working toward legislation known as Katelyn's Law, aimed at giving prosecutors more room to pursue additional charges in cases involving concealment following involuntary manslaughter. An attempt to make sure no other family has to watch someone get away with hiding what they did for over a decade. Katelyn is remembered by everyone who knew her exactly the way she lived. Bubbly, artistic, endlessly goofy, the kind of person a room simply felt better for having in it. Her family has spoken about the butterflies she loved, worn now at memorials and courtroom appearances in her honor, and about the future she never got to have. The career, the art, the life that was taken from her in the span of a single night and then hidden for 13 years by someone she trusted completely. So here's what I want to leave you with. Do you think what happened to Katelyn was a planned act, or something that genuinely spiraled out of control in a moment neither of them saw coming? And knowing what we know now, does 3 years feel anywhere close to justice for 13 years of concealment? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If this case affected you the way it affected me, hit subscribe. We decode a new case every single week, and you will not want to miss what's coming next. Stay sharp, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.